Are super rich people actually happy?
And that includes closing down tax havens around Britain and in British territories, as well as around Europe, such as Monaco.
In benefit system, all those things which actually provides for a vibrant economy. Can you allow me to finish? Do you mind?
Yeah, but I asked you a question and you're ignoring it.
No, I'm not ignoring the question. If you'd give me a minute, I'll answer it. The point is this. Listen for a minute, if you don't mind.
Sorry?
What happens if they just went independent?
Well, if they go independent, that's their choice. But,
no, but you wouldn't close them down as a tax haven.
Well, yeah, hang on a minute.
Why did you call Hamas and Hezbollah your friends?
Now, Jeremy Corbyn, you've invited Hezbollah, Hamas, the IRA to Parliament in the past. You've called them your friends. Is there any terrorist group beyond the pale for a cosy chat on the House of Commons terrace with you? Now, on Northern Ireland, you didn't just deal with Sinn Féin. You dealt with the IRA 3 weeks after the Brighton bomb, in which the IRA had tried to destroy the democratically elected government of this country. You invited 2 convicted IRA terrorists to the House of Commons.
They were former prisoners who had come out of prison, women who had come out of prison, came to Parliament, actually in a meeting that had been arranged long before, to talk about prison conditions and rehabilitation of prisoners.
They were IRA.
Is there anything wrong with that, since they had a spent conviction?
They had their organisation had just tried to blow up the British government.
I mean, essentially, Conservatives and UKIP got half the total vote.
UKIP
Labour, SNP, Greens, they didn't get as much as Conservative and UKIP.
UKIP is a devil-may-care vote. It's also motivated to some extent by racism.
You're going to need to get some of those UKIP voters back, who incidentally you've just asserted are racist in some cases.
In some cases, yeah.
And that's what he's done. He's a racist scumbag trying to blame immigrants for the cutbacks because of he's rich. Thank you, sorry.
I haven't really read as much of Marx as I should have done. I've read quite a bit, but not that much. And I think Marx's transition of history and the analysis of how you go from feudalism to capitalism and move on to a different stage is fascinating. So we all owe something to it. Probably inside you, even you do.
Well, good evening. And you thought that Bill Shorten was a left-wing interventionist pro-union Labor leader. He's nothing on Jeremy Corbyn. My name's Tom Switzer, and welcome to you all to the Centre for Independent Studies. I'm the new Executive Director here at CIS. For those of you who don't know CIS, we are a research public policy organisation, been around since 1976. And we're fundamentally committed to the principles of classical liberalism and conservative approaches to governance. We all know that we face some very serious challenges throughout the world. Classical liberalism, free market economics, cultural conservatism is all too often on the back foot, and nowhere demonstrates that point more than Great Britain. The Tory ruling government of Prime Minister Theresa May is in disarray. The Labor opposition leadership under Jeremy Corbyn is on the march and lurching well and truly to the ideological left. And meanwhile, all of this is taking place against the backdrop of Brexit and, of course, last year's election disaster for the Conservatives. I can't think of a better person to talk about British politics than our guest today. Eamonn Butler is the Executive Director of the Adam Smith Institute, which he co-founded around the time that Greg Lindsay co-founded the Centre for Independent Studies. He's also author of several acclaimed books on legendary free marketeers, Friedman, Hayek and von Mises. Ladies and gentlemen, Eamonn Butler. Eamonn, before I ask the first question, let's get a sense of Jeremy Corbyn.
I was in Brussels meeting with heads of government and leaders of European socialist parties, one of whom said to me, Mr. Speaker.
Eamonn, who is Jeremy Corbyn?
Oh, I honestly don't know why you're obsessed with this man. He's a puff of wind. he's a radical international socialist. He's fundamentally a Leninist. He has come to power in his own party because the rules of the Labour Party were changed to keep out anybody like Blair. And so now they've got the complete opposite. Instead of a centrist, they've got an extremist. And in the election, although it was talked up as a disaster for Mrs May, which indeed it was, because of her own incompetence, he's still 60 seats behind the Conservatives, and we're going to have redistricting shortly, which is going to give the Conservatives another 15 or maybe even 20 seats. So, if anybody's taking bets or in business, he is not going to become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So I really don't know why you're so obsessed with it.
Well, to be fair, 3 decades ago, one of our ideological and political heroes was Margaret Thatcher. She was a transformative figure, so much so that she made sure that Labor under Tony Blair could not resist the gravitational pull to the free market right. Tony Blair, of course, knew Labor, triangulation, smaller government, more efficient free markets and whatnot. How do you account then for the fact that the centre of political and ideological gravity has shifted towards the more interventionist left?
Well, I think there are two different things going on here. Firstly, I think people are voting against established politicians. And I'm with them, frankly, because the established politicians have carved it up for their own benefit. This is why Corbyn has some resonance. He's absolutely right. Yes, it's a cosy, a corporatist economy, and the politicians are in league with the business people, and they're in league with the media and all the rest of it. And it's a sort of political class. And most of the great British public, and I think probably most of the public in the United States, most of the public in Europe, just don't feel as if they're part of that political class. So they're rebelling against it. They're voting for Trump in America. They're voting for Brexit in the UK. They're voting against the Conservatives in the UK. They're voting for extremist parties in Germany. All over the world, this is happening, and it's a sea change in politics that we actually have to get used to.
You mentioned Bernie Sanders on the left and the Democrat Party. Of course, in France, there was a near miss by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was a far left, some say a communist. He came very close in the first round of those French elections a year ago. Is there an argument to be made that honest socialism appeals to a lot of ordinary working folks who have been displaced by globalisation?
No, because certainly I can only speak for my own country. In my own country, there's a sort of tension, which is that globalization means, right, we're getting cheap goods from all over the world, or cheaper goods from all over the world. The European Union is a bit of a barrier to that, but we are doing that. We're getting lots of people coming in from Eastern Europe who are extremely good plumbers and electricians and cleaners and all sorts of things like that. So we benefit from that. So we see that there are benefits of this, but at the same time, huge waves of immigration. It does rankle. So we're a bit tense about that. But I wouldn't say that it's people flooding towards sort of revolutionary socialism. I don't think that's what's happening at all. People don't vote for governments, they vote against them. And they voted against Mrs May's government because it was completely and hopelessly, impossibly useless.
Owen Jones from the Guardian newspaper, a young millennial
He's
socialist.
not as young as he claims to be, but he looks young, but he's not.
In the aftermath of the British election in June, July last year, he says that millions were inspired by a radical manifesto that promised to transform Britain, to attack injustices and challenge the vested interests holding the country back. Owen Jones went on to say, people believe the booming well-off should pay more, that we should invest that money in schools, hospitals, houses, police, public services, that in all work should have a genuine living wage, and young people should not be saddled with debt for aspiring to an education, that our utilities should be under the control of the people of this country. Now, Owen Jones does reflect the thoughts and attitudes of a lot of these British millennials, correct?
Owen Jones is another puff of wind, and his, his parents were university professors and all the rest of it. He's not remotely working, doesn't remotely reflect the working class. People like me that actually reflect the working class. My dad was a mechanic. So we know what it's like to be poor. He's never suffered that kind of stuff, so he doesn't know about it. It's just ideological. And I think you've got all this ideological cant coming out. The point is, of course, that there's just a sort of kernel of truth that you can build something around. That people do feel that the political system is not working for them, that it works for the boss classes, it works for the politicians. They've got a nice cushy life, and the rest of us, aren't really getting a say. So, absolutely, there is something in that.
Now, Corbyn is widely seen as a radical, and his disciples see himself as a radical. Tell us about his foreign policy.
Well, he's a pacifist. He believes that no wars since 1945 have been justified. He is against intervention in Syria and the Middle East. He thinks that NATO should be disbanded, but at the same time he has sufficient political realism to think that, well, that's not actually going to happen, so he wants NATO to be reined back. And he thinks that NATO was responsible for the crisis in Crimea where the Russians invaded.
But to be
He's
fair,
not entirely wrong on that
that's
one,
more or less Donald Trump's position and the view of a lot of foreign policy realists, that NATO was a creature of the Cold War. It was designed to contain Soviet communism. Surely a quarter of a century later, there's not such a strategic rationale for NATO. So doesn't Corbyn have a point?
Well, we want to keep the Americans online, the Europeans don't spend enough on defence. I mean, they're right in the front line, and it's the UK, France to a certain extent, and America that spend money on defence. So that's a real problem. And what Trump is saying, basically, Trump is, I believe, I don't know, I've never met the man, but I believe that he actually, of course, supports pattern, I have to say, is building up that he's talking to lots of very unsavoury people.
Eamonn, it strikes me that Jeremy Corbyn, obviously radical on the left, the last time the British Labour Party elected as their leader a radical left-wing figure was Michael Foot in 1983, who was annihilated by Margaret Thatcher in that year's general election. But could you argue that the ideological and economic trends are less friendly to the West today than they were 30 years ago?
Well, I think the free market ideology is strong. And I don't think that it is being supported by our politicians. I think certainly the difficulty that we have in Europe in general, but certainly in the UK, is that we have politicians who are professional politicians. They've never had an outside job in their lives. I can explain why that should be. But they've never had a proper job in their lives. They don't know how business works. They don't know how ordinary people live. They are professional politicians. They leave school. They become involved in a university political club, they join a trade union, or they join a a PR agency if they're Tories, and then they take a job as a councillor, and then they get a job as a they fight a bad seat, and then they fight a good seat, and then they become a junior minister and a senior minister. They've never actually seen the real world. They've never actually had a proper job in their lives. And so it's not surprising that those people are estranged from the great British public, and it's no surprising the great British public is saying, well, up your bum.
You know, Margaret Thatcher once slapped down a copy of a Frederick Hayek book on the cabinet round table, and she told her front bench colleagues at number 10 Downing Street, "This is what we believe in." How have we gone from that moment to the moment where the shadow chancellor, the shadow treasurer in Britain, John McConnell, will praise the works of Karl Marx's Das Kapital and say this in the House of Commons?
Hear about the contents of the book.
I think you'll find this invaluable. Well, let me offer. I thought this would help him, Mr. Speaker. Let's quote from Mao, rarely done in this chamber. The quote is this. Behave. We must learn to do economic work from all who know how, no matter who they are. We must esteem them as teachers, learning from them respectfully and conscientiously. The problem is, half the shadow cabinet have been sent off to re-education.
George Osborne, the then Tory Chancellor. Eamonn Butler, how do you account for the fact we've gone from Hayek to Mao in 30 years?
You know, McConnell is the dangerous one. Forget Corbyn, right? He looks like a sort of international socialist from the 60s, and he is an international socialist from the 60s. McConnell looks like a businessman. He speaks like a business person. He wears nice suits and ties, and he always sounds extremely moderate, but he's a bloody international Marxist. And if Corbyn fell under a bus, then that would be, I think, a real problem.
So he's more Marxist than Jeremy Corbyn, then?
No, he's just more slippery, more electable, more, nicer and smoother, and knows what to say and how to present these things. You know, he still believes in nationalising all the industries and supporting the trade unions and doing all of that stuff that got us into the problems in the first place. But he is a problem.
Now, you mentioned that the Tories have clearly failed to refute the Corbyn agenda. Why haven't the Conservatives today explained to the public, as Margaret Thatcher all too often did throughout the 70s and 80s and early 90s, the profound connection between smaller government and greater individual freedom?
Yeah, well, one reason is because they're all professional politicians. So they have an interest in keeping government large, and they might say, yes, we believe in smaller government, but they're not very enthusiastic about cutting it back. Another reason, I think, is that our democracy has changed, that I believe in democracy. I think it's an extremely good way of deciding a few things that you can't actually decide by any other means. But it's a very bad way of deciding everything. And the trouble is, we're always told democracy is wonderful, great system, fabulous, and our politicians say it's a brilliant system. And so the argument is, well, whatever issue comes up, we should have more democracy. We should decide it by the democratic process. And if it's healthcare, we decide it democratically. If it's education, we decide it democratically. Welfare, yes, absolutely. So what's happening, of course, is that means that we decide things democratically. In other words, we decide it politically. So, and this is spread, and the politicians don't have the sort of ideological understanding of classical liberalism, which would make them realize, no, there are limits to this. Democracy, politics is a bad way of deciding how big your Coca-Cola bottle should be. It's not, that's not what it's about, or whether people should be able to smoke in their own home or take drugs or anything else. It's not the way to do that.
But a simple question, does Theresa May, the Prime Minister, believe in free markets or in controlling them?
She doesn't. She's not against free markets, but she is a managerialist, just as Cameron was a managerialist. And this runs very deep in the Tory party, and I've been watching it for the last 45 years. And there is, the Labour, the left come up and they say, we've got this agenda and it's finding a wonderful workers' paradise and all that sort of stuff. And the Tories think, well, perhaps we could just hold it a bit and slow it down a bit. So there's a sort of ratchet like that. And then the Tories sort of regard their role as being to manage the economy. Vote for us because we can manage things better than others. So they've lost that, since Mrs. Thatcher, they've lost that ideology. But Mrs. Thatcher was an exception, right? I mean, most politicians are useless. Mrs. Thatcher was incredible. And, we've been very lucky, actually, with our politicians in the UK. We had Churchill, fine. Attlee, you could say, was a brilliant politician.
Even though he was a socialist.
Even though he was a socialist, he nationalised everything and ended up with strikes everywhere, but he was a brilliant politician. And then we had, Mrs. Thatcher, then we had Blair, who again was a sort of centrist, but again, stuck in for more than 10 years, and he could just handle things. But these are the exception. Most politicians just are drifting, and so government gets bigger and bigger, and there's no real ideology to rein it back, and they think, well, we can manage all this, and we can manage it better than the other guys.
Yeah, when the Labour-dominated government in the City of London, in a classic left-wing regulatory collision act, they decided to heed the pleas of all the taxi drivers by putting a ban on Uber. This was late last year. Where was Theresa May and the Conservatives making the case for free markets? My former colleagues at The Spectator said, why didn't the Tories explain how deregulation, remember Uber's part of that process, why didn't the Tories explain how deregulation leads to more choices for consumers and more economic opportunities for workers? How come the Tories didn't make that case?
This is managerialism again, and it's something that you find in professional politicians. As I say, politicians who've never actually driven a taxi or run an Uber or started a business or whatever. They were nowhere. I use Uber all the time, and I use
in London.
Oh yeah.
But how can you do that?
Because it's still going. There was.
Isn't it bad?
Oh no! They've tried, and the taxi drivers have brought central London to a halt on 2 occasions, but they haven't yet got it because there's like 2 million people in London who use the damn thing. Yeah. So you've got a constituency there, and I use it just so I can stand on the street corner looking at my phone, waiting for the Uber to come with all the taxis, the black taxis coming out. And so I love it. But no, it was worse. It's worse. It's worse than what you say. Because what happened is that the government, faced with this Airbnb and Uber and all of these other sharing economy things, what did they do? They set up somebody to review the so-called gig economy. And who did they get to do it? They got the guy who, his father was a Marxist, who appeared on the BBC all the time and had his own radio show. The guy himself ran the biggest left-wing think tank, and then he graduated to the Royal Society of Arts, which is a very grand organisation, and he started to run that. And they appointed him to do a report on the gig economy and how it should be managed and what regulations there should be. And I thought, you stupid... what answer do you think is going to come out? And the answer that comes out is, well, people who work, in Uber and so on, they deserve 9 weeks holiday just like everybody else, and they deserve, their rights to be written out and so on. No, they don't. Right? They're driving or Airbnb. Again under the pressure from the hotel lobby. A lot of people are saying, well, Airbnb, they ought to be regulated and you ought to have standards and all the rest of it. Not realising that the web does this. The web regulates these things.
But what about the point about the power of ideas and authenticity? I mean, this is what the commentariat in Britain are saying about Corbyn and McDonald, that they're genuine, they are authentic, they're true believers, they're rallying against an establishment that is out of touch with the thoughts and attitudes of Middle Britain. James Bartholomew is a former venture capitalist who now writes a brilliant column in the Daily Telegraph. He will be a guest here at CIS later this year, I think in October, as our scholar in residence. He raises the question, why can't the Tories embrace their own best instincts on reform and deregulation with the same enthusiasm and authenticity as the Corbynistas, as they embrace Labor's worst impulses on taxes and spending?
Yeah, well, I wish. As I say, I think the Tories, there's this very deep thing in the psyche of the Conservatives that we are better managers than the other guys. So, let us manage. And we will manage. And it's kind of managed decline, actually. And there's very few people who have the ideological background. We're trying. But I think that with 24/7 professional politicians, that's extremely difficult to do. I would love to see term limits and so on, so you can't make a career out of politics. So you've actually got to do a proper job, and then you understand how these things work.
When Theresa May was elected Tory leader after the Brexit vote, and leading up to May, when she called last year's general election, she was overwhelming favourite to win a landslide election, a la Ronald Reagan in 1984. It didn't pan out that way, and everything's been going downhill ever since. Let's look at her some of the key moments from the Tory party conference speech she delivered late last year.
Oh no.
While our opponents flirt with a foreign policy of neutrality and prepare for a run on the ground.
P45, a resignation speech.
Some people say we've spent too much time talking about Jeremy Corbyn's past. You may not have heard me say that. So some people say we've spent too much time talking about Jeremy Corbyn's past. I was about to talk about somebody I'd like to give a P45 to, and that's Jeremy Corbyn. Public sector working together, we have bounced back. We've created record numbers of jobs. So, while we will never, excuse me, we will never hesitate to act where businesses aren't operating as they should. Let this party celebrate the wealth creators, the risk takers, the innovators and entrepreneurs. And strength that was shared around.
Mrs. Amber Rudd, the Tory frontbencher, imploring her colleagues to get up and congratulate their leader. There we go. There's Boris Johnson there. Well, can you think of a worse debacle for a political leader? How do you account for the fact that she's declined so dramatically in such a short period of time?
I think it's very difficult when you've got a very slim majority. Okay, she fought an election with prospects of winning a larger majority, which is the reason that she called it, so that she would have a strong bargaining case for Brexit. And she did everything wrong. The manifesto was fundamentally written by a couple of people in Downing Street who were with her when she was Home Secretary. I didn't know them. They hadn't come through the movement at all. I didn't know them even as Conservatives. They were sort of apparatchiks, and then she took them to Downing Street, and they basically wrote the manifesto without checking it with any ministers. You know, ministers might actually have an interest in the policy for their department. They might actually have an idea as to what policies are likely to go down well with the electorate and not. But no, you know, she got these guys to write that manifesto. So that was absolute disaster, and she just did everything wrong. And then now you've got the situation, and it's a bit like the situation that we had with John Major when he had a majority of just 20. And if you've got a majority of 20, it only takes 10 troublemakers to bring you down. And so you've got to give in to everybody, you've got to try and be nice to everybody, you've got to try and hold everybody together, even though they're fighting and they've got different views. It's an impossible situation.
What complicates matters too is the countdown for the British withdrawal from the European Union.
Yeah, sure.
It's next year.
Yeah,
what's your position on Brexit, Eamonn?
Well, in 1974, when we had a referendum on whether we should stay in the European Union, I was actually in favour of staying. I was only a nipper at the time, but
so was Margaret Thatcher too, by the way, correct? She supported the common market in the mid-70s?
I'm not sure about that. Yeah, well, we were sold it as being a common market.
Meaning free trade.
Yeah, that's right, rather than a
and that's why people like Jeremy Corbyn and the left of the British Labour Party opposed the European Union or the British inclusion in the common market, correct?
Well,
in 70s?
In the 70s, yes, absolutely right. Yes, they saw it as, they wanted to run Britain as a socialist paradise. We wanted to get Britain into the European Union precisely because we thought it would stop us becoming a socialist paradise, or hell, whatever it is. And so I was actually on the board of the Young European Federalists, if you can believe that. And now I'm older and wiser. And I think that basically under the Blair years, I thought, right, this is it. It's changed, right? It's become very much more of a political union. Yeah. Blair signed us up to all of this regulation on the workplace and the social chapter and all of this kind of stuff. And I thought, no, there were benefits from being a member of a bigger market. That's all.
Yeah, John Howard, the former Australian Prime Minister, at the height of the famous asylum seeker standoff in 2001, famously said, "We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come." Do you think that message resonated with a large chunk of the British people in the lead up to the Brexit vote?
To be honest, I think it did, and I sort of slightly regret the way the campaign went. The campaign originated talking about markets and the regulation that we have and the fact that we have huge trade barriers with the outside world, including Australia, New Zealand and so on, especially on things like agricultural goods. And that was great. And then the argument sort of turned to be kind of slightly anti-immigration, which I'm not very comfortable with. But at the same time, I think I can see that the great British public have a point, which is that why should we admit anybody from 400 million people in the in the European Union? Any of those 400 million people have the right to come to the UK and stay and work and live there, and we've got no controls over it. We just have to accept it. Why shouldn't we say, right, if we need more nurses, there's a whole world out there. We need more doctors. India produces great doctors. Why don't we get them in?
So a lot of the Brexiteers saw the Brexit vote as a reaffirmation of national sovereignty. Your argument is more a classical liberal one that, Britain's future trading partners should be global and not confined to Brussels and the continent. Do you see expanded British trade relations with Australia in the coming decade?
Oh, definitely, yes. I think that one of the arguments in '74 was, we're going to have barriers against New Zealand butter and lamb and all of that kind of stuff, and Australian goods.
Daniel Hannan has actually spoken about that very issue here a few years ago. Yep.
Right, and so people were nervous about it at the time, and I think that more recently, I think the Brexiteers, I'm a Brexiteer. I think we should leave tomorrow without a deal. I couldn't care less about a deal. I think we should get out.
What about if you don't get a free trade agreement?
I don't care. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
But the conventional wisdom, though, Eamonn, would be that if you don't get a free trade deal with Brussels and Britain leaves the European Union, you're going to downgrade a growth forecast.
No, absolute nonsense. Look, you've been listening to the ruddy Treasury. the Treasury, before the Brexit vote, said that we're going to have an economic disaster. The place is booming, right? It's growing faster than anywhere in Europe. People are investing there. Okay, yeah, sure. One or two companies have relocated some people to the continent just in case. But other companies are investing.
Yeah, but then again, can I just put you on the spot here? Why doesn't Theresa May and her senior ministers, especially her Chancellor, Philip Hammond, lead the charge for lower taxes and deregulation to encourage a post-Brexit investment boom? I never hear this.
I wish they would. What they're stuck with is, we're trying to negotiate a deal with the European Union. As I say, I think it would be better if we didn't negotiate, if we just left and then we could leave on our own terms and turn the whole ruddy country into a tax haven. But if you are trying to, thank you very much. If you're trying to do a deal with the European Union, now the first thing they say is, well, when you leave, don't try making yourself a tax haven, mate, or you'll be real trouble. So they are desperately trying to stop Britain from reducing corporation tax, for example, which I think should be zero, because 2/3 of corporation tax is actually paid by workers and customers. It isn't paid by the boss classes. We want to do all of these things, but we're in negotiations, and the argument is, we have to be nice to them, and so on. So that's the reason.
Now, some will say that the only forceful, true-believing exponent of Brexit in the Tory front bench is the former Mayor of London. Former Mayor of London, the former editor of The Spectator, now frontbencher, Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. Let's hear from Boris.
Yeah. He's unusually quiet.
Yes, Boris Johnson is coming up any moment. He's a quirky character, isn't he?
Boris is Boris. He doesn't fit into any natural mould, I have to say. He's his own person, and I've seen him on many, many occasions, and he was
the former Brussels correspondent of the Daily Telegraph.
Yes, worked on the Telegraph.
That's where he made his name, right?
Editor of the Spectator at one point. Yes, absolutely. But he is, he's not a regular politician. And
that's part of his appeal, a bit like Corbyn, but in reverse,
yes.
right?
Yeah, that's right, yes. In fact, my wife joined the Tory party just so she could vote for Boris.
Is that a fact? I think on the eve of the 2005 election, on the eve of the 2005 election, the Michael Howard, Tony Blair election, he famously said that if you vote Tory, you'll get all the women you like in the world. Something crazy like that. Have we got Boris Johnson coming up?
Come on, Boris.
Well, listen, before we get to Boris, he has his critics. Max Hastings.
We'll continue to go
here we go.
On
Boris
cheapo flights to stag parties in ancient cities, where we'll receive, I'm sure, a warm welcome. I mean, interesting people fall in love, struggle amiably to learn the other European languages, whose knowledge of which, by the way, has suffered a paradoxical decline during our membership of the EU. And there's no sensible reason why we should not continue to be able to retire to Spain, or indeed anywhere else, as we did indeed long before Spain joined what was then called the Common Market. We can continue the whirl of academic exchanges that have been a feature of European cultural life since the Middle Ages. Brexit is about re-engaging this country with its global identity and all the energy that can flow from that. And I absolutely refuse to accept the suggestion that it is some un-British spasm of bad manners. It's not some great V sign from the cliffs of Dover.
It's Boris Johnson at the Policy Exchange, which happens to be a centre-right free market think tank, not dissimilar to our outfits. It's chaired by the High Commissioner, Alexander Downer, small world. What do you make of Boris, his argument about Brexit, and more intriguingly, is he capable of being the next Tory leader and, as a result, Prime Minister?
He's absolutely right on Brexit. We want to leave the European Union. We want to leave a network of regulations and controls and way of government. We don't want to leave Europe. We're a part of Europe. We've always been a part of Europe. And people say, oh, well, with Brexit, you'll need a visa to go to France. Absolute nonsense. I used to go to France with like a little piece of cardboard. It didn't even have my picture on it, and you could go. called a British visitor's passport, and so we had very liberal immigration and all that. We got on famously. We had cooperation and all the rest of it, and then we had the EU, which is a way of governing all of this stuff. And it's just we've got enough government. We don't want any more government, thanks very much, and we certainly don't want any more regulation. And we don't want the European sort of legal system, which is a top-down Napoleonic system, whereas ours is a common law system. It's liberal. You do what you like, and then if it causes a trouble, then we'll pass a law, as opposed to the continental system, which is you can't do anything unless there's a law saying you can. And that's corroded our legal system. So we want out of that, but we want to be part of Europe. Yeah, because what's the problem? And we want people to come to Britain from Europe, and we want Brits to go to Europe, and we want to do trade. It's fantastic. Why don't we do that?
What about Boris's political prospects? Because Theresa May is widely seen as damaged goods. Boris Johnson is obviously popular in London, but to what extent does he resonate with the Tory movement more broadly?
Well, as I said, my wife joined the Tories just because she thought he was the greatest hope since Thatcher, which is going back a way. And I think at that point, had he won that leadership election instead of withdrawing, which is what he did against Theresa May,
2016,
he could have been the party leader. Now, of course, we've seen him as a minister, and he's not a minister; he's Boris, right? And he's just got his way of doing things, and everybody goes, "Oh no, what's he going to say next?" Yeah. So I don't think he's actually a credible leader. But then there's not going to be a leadership election anytime soon, because the Tories are absolutely terrified of having an election, because if they had a leadership election, the first thing that would happen is everybody would say, the BBC particularly would be saying, well, whoever won this election has got no mandate, when are the Tories going to go and get a mandate from the people? So we'd have another election, and the Tories, having had one referendum and 2 elections in no time, would not do very well.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like the Liberal Party here in Australia with our leadership turmoil. But a little aside, did you know that Theresa May, Emmanuel Macron, and listened to it recently, Malcolm Turnbull, our Prime Minister, Angela Merkel in Germany, they have lower approval ratings than one Donald Trump. Max Hastings is a very distinguished British historian and journalist, and he was Boris's boss for many years at the Daily Telegraph.
Oh, that's right.
He had this to say about Boris just recently. Boris is a man who is obliged to pay for extra weight at airports because of all the skeletons in his luggage. Many of them, those of women he has betrayed. When he first considered, I'm saying this because of the context of Barnaby Joyce, of course. When he first considered running for London Mayor back in 2008, he took me, Max Hastings, to lunch and asked if I could offer any advice. This is Max Hastings, who's a distinguished historian. Sir Max, Boris, you need to, quote, lock up your willy. Max goes on to say, it seemed to me that he could not credibly step onto a big political stage unless he was willing to abandon his career of manic sexual adventuring. What was at stake was not morality, which I've absolutely no claim to pontificate about, but rather the need to practice a self-discipline that is vital to any successful political career. Eamonn Butler on Max Hastings.
Yes, I don't think that self-discipline is Boris's big thing, I have to say. I think the British public are quite forgiving on these things up to a point. That we sort of think that this is your private life and you should get on with it, unless you're being hypocritical. I mean, if you're talking about family values and all that stuff, and then it turns out you have a love child, that's a different thing. And John Major got into difficulties on that kind of thing because his slogan was back to basics, and then of course the first sexual scandal there was in his cabinet, then back to basics, eh? Ha ha ha. And so you lose a lot of credibility doing that. I mean, everybody knows what Boris is like, and they know about his background, and I think they sort of think, well, that's for him to sort out. It's not a political issue.
Now it's time for Q&A, and our first question will come from Blaise Joseph, my colleague from the Centre for Independent Studies.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. If you don't mind, we might go back to Jeremy Corbyn, if you don't mind. Why do you think the criticisms of Corbyn have been apparently ineffective? I mean, if his policies are really so crazy, what is it about the attacks on him which haven't worked? Do you think perhaps it's because they've been a tiny bit too condescending, and that they're implying that anyone who's thinking of voting for him is stupid, and that has the effect of making people think, well, hang on, I'm not stupid, how dare you imply I'm stupid? Here's a double finger, I'm going to vote for him twice. Similar to perhaps the attitude towards Trump voters. So if you could give your thoughts on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
All of that is true. I think that Corbyn's appeal is the fact that he is a very natural person. I mean, I've never met him one-to-one, but I've sort of seen him in the House of Commons taking groups round and all the rest of it. And he's obviously just such a nice guy. And he's such an honest guy. He actually, believes in all of this stuff. I think this is all crazy, but he believes in it. And you can see that he believes in it. When Mrs. May does her thing at the Tory party conference, entrepreneurship and all that, does she believe in it? Well, it doesn't really look terribly genuine, does it? So he's motivated by this stuff because he's dyed in the wool on this stuff. He's born to this stuff almost. And so people look at it and say, well, at last, like they do with Trump, at last, a politician who actually says it like it is, who will talk about his own beliefs. And I think probably like Trump, they take him seriously, but not necessarily literally. I think that they think, yeah, this is exactly what we believe in. Yeah, we know he wouldn't be able to do all this stuff, but yeah, he's absolutely right. Give them a shock.
Eugenie.
I really enjoyed the discussion, and my question's going to go back to Theresa May.
It's a deeply depressing subject.
Sorry. You mentioned the Tory manifesto in the lead up to the election last year. And one thing that fascinates me about what's happening in Australia is politicians' fear of taking forward so-called brave policies, particularly any sort of policy that will reduce the size of government or cut back spending. And there's a real reluctance for any policy to have what I term losers in it. Every policy needs to help everyone. But the Tory manifesto included something that was controversially known as the dementia tax. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that, whether the Tory party that was a complete mess up in the way they sold it, or do you think there's fundamentally a problem with brave policy now?
I think there is a problem with being brave. I think there always has been. I think it's got worse, and I think that it's got worse because of this change in democracy. We don't have democracy; we have populism. In fact, I might actually do this. I've been thinking for some time of writing a little book called "One Cheer for Democracy," because democracy is a great system, but I don't think that we have it anymore. I think we have populism, and partly I blame Rupert Murdoch and the 24-hour news cycle, and they have to fill the 24-hour news cycle. So you get this unholy alliance between politicians and the media, and that's the whole discussion. And they all think that something should be done instead of, I think, no, don't do anything. It'll sort itself out. So I think is our problem. I think we have a real problem with democracy, and it's almost embarrassing to say this, but I really do, and I think that we need to address it, and I think that we need sort of liberal thinkers like Centre for Independent Study to be saying this and saying that democracy works provided it's limited, and you need to respect people's rights and all that. So I think that's part of it.
James Bartholomew, whom I mentioned earlier, he'll be out here later in the year. He's compiled a lot of polling data that shows that 70% of British millennials, these are folks primarily aged in their 20s and early 30s, they don't know who Mao Zedong is. 70% don't know who Mao Zedong is, and a majority, and the 30% who do know who Mao Zedong is, a majority of them think he was actually a pretty good bloke. One other astonishing bit of material that James Bartholomew has unearthed. is that something like, I'm not sure of the exact detail, but 59, 60, 62% of millennials think that George W. Bush killed more people than Joseph Stalin.
Yeah.
What is wrong with the British education system?
No, I think that things just move on, and I and the ancient Greg over there both remember what it was
He's
like.
still here.
I remember going through Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, yeah, and you could see what it was like on the other side, and it was dire. And nobody would talk to you and all the rest of it. Everybody was living in fear, and it was drab and miserable, and there was nothing to do. We remember that. I think young people, I mean, my kids don't remember that. They weren't born there. I took them back to Berlin when they were smallish, and I said, well, you can't see it now, but the wall was here, and we people trapped behind. They said, well, why didn't people just jump over the wall? Oh God! Right, if you'd seen it, it was like about half a mile wide with gun posts and barbed wire and chicanes and all the rest of it. So they've never experienced that. And in the bar of King's College, Cambridge, over the bar is a hammer and sickle, and you think they just don't get it, do they? I mean, that flag killed about 80 million people. Yeah. Mao killed, another 40. And people don't know that, which is why James Bartholomew, I'm glad to see he's coming here, because he's doing a great job. He's trying to create this online and then a real museum of communist terror to show people what it was like. And he's done some brilliant little videos. I hope you get them and share them with people.
Absolutely.
Just people talking about their experiences and we need to do it now because these people are dying off.
It's depressing, isn't it? It reminds one of the Roman statesman Cicero's remark that to ignore what happened before you were born is to always remain a child. Next question. Yes, sir. Could we get the video, the audio here for you? Just wait for the mic. Yeah.
So, if I recall from the British election that they had last year and the commentary after that election, one of the themes of that election that was talked about was Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party were able to stitch a narrative together as to why people should vote for them, whereas the Theresa May Conservatives were unable to stitch a narrative together. They weren't able to be convincing in anything. I think to a certain extent, the Turnbull government in Australia has done exactly the same thing. They're unable to stitch a narrative together for why free market's good, why liberalism is good, why we should vote for them. So how do you believe, or do you believe that we can retake that narrative, that we can actually construct that narrative, make people vote for liberalism again? How do you think we can do it?
I like a question from a man who's got bright socks like me. Look, I'm an optimist on these things. I think, I have very little faith in politicians. It's easier if you're in opposition, I have to say, right? You're in opposition, you can stitch together a narrative and say, well, we could spend more money on this, and we could, improve that, and we could get rid of all the tax concessions and give it to the poor and all. It's easy to do that if you're in opposition. If you're in government, and you say that, then certain people in think tanks are going to rip that to shreds because it's just nonsense. So, it is more difficult, and that means that any opposition can weave together a narrative much more easily, I think. I remain optimistic. I mean, I think that there are many, many good people in the Conservative Party in Parliament. We've actually lost a few, I have to say. We've lost some very good ones who came in, let's say, 2010 and so on, and just thought, oh, forget it, this is hopeless. I hate this life, and, I'm not being lobby fodder and all the rest of it. So we've lost some good people. But at the same time, there still are some extremely good people who are liberal and sort of Austrian economist type people in Parliament. So we need to work with those, and we're trying to work with those, to produce an alternative narrative. When you're in government, it's extremely difficult to do that because you can't say things that are outside the party line. That a certain line is agreed, and every minister, 100 of them right down in the government, are expected to support that.
But that's one of the perils.
Boris
of the
doesn't, obviously,
yeah, well, he's an exception.
Yeah,
but the Westminster tradition is different from the American system in that regard, isn't it?
Oh yeah, the American system is much more open, and people say what they
One
like.
final question. Oh, yep, make it easy. Yep, sorry.
I'd just like to get your thoughts on conspiracy theories, fake news, and the internet.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a cock-up theorist. I think most things are a cock-up. You know, when something goes wrong, it's usually a cock-up. You know, I've just seen it so often in politics, and very rarely have I seen conspiracies. The internet is interesting because, as you say, or you imply, it has the power to spread all sorts of news, good and bad. I mean, I get lots of good, interesting, useful news from the internet, but also sometimes you look at things and you think, is that true? You know, is somebody winding me up here? So there is a problem, and I think that is why it's one of the reasons why I'm a believer in a representative government. I think you do actually need to elect people whose job it is to take long-term decisions about public life and the way we're governed, rather than just leave it to the mob, because I think there's all sorts of hopelessly inaccurate information out there. So again, I'm optimistic. I mean, it's interesting how the internet has its own regulatory systems, and if I tweet something online and it's wrong, I mean, everybody, wow, it's amazing the flack you will get, and you think, oh gosh, right, we better pull that one then. So
that doesn't
it does have a
Donald Trump, though.
It does have a reality check. Well, Donald is Donald, isn't he? I mean, he's a bit like Boris, right? Everybody just enjoys the. It adds to the gaiety of the nation. I mean, people just enjoy the spectacle, and I love it because it just confuses everybody. It confuses the media. They just don't know how to treat Trump, and it confuses Miss Kim and all these other people, and the Chinese. It used to be the Chinese that were inscrutable. You would never know what they would do. Now it's Donald Trump.
Okay, now for the vote of thanks, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage our founding executive director, my predecessor, and colleague, Greg Lindsay.
Otherwise known as Ancient Greg, apparently. I've known Eamonn, we worked it out 40 years this year. Yes. CIS is a little bit older. Adam Smith Institute, about the same?
Yeah, about the same.
Yeah, we both went to a meeting of the Montpellier Society in Hong Kong. And we've both been through Checkpoint Charlie when the MPS meeting in Berlin in 1982. Right, yeah. If you look outside before you go down on the lift, on the left-hand side, there's a large chunk of the Berlin Wall, with above it a graphic that was taken from I think Deutsche Bank or someone like that produced a book of graphics of the Berlin Wall, and there's this, I think it's The World in Chains or something like that. So, I mean, if people come into this place, they get a little reminder as they go out. And I think the millennials and so forth, maybe the James Bartholomew exercise or whatever, will prove to be really something important. Like Eamonn, I'm an optimist, but a lot of what he had to say was a little bit depressing. But we can live with that, I suppose. Looking back on Jeremy Corbyn, and he said he hadn't quite read enough Marx or something. Well, if he comes here, all that stuff up there, courtesy of the late Paddy McGuinness, who knew more about Marx than just about anybody, certainly Jeremy Corbyn. So, look, we've had a terrific discussion. One of the real takeaways for me, and it's something that's been occupying my mind for quite some time, is this problem of democracy. I agree with Eamonn on his approach to it, but there are problems with it, and we need to figure out how to deal with it. There's a wonderful book written by Micklethwaite and Woolridge called The Fourth Revolution, and in that they describe the problem with democracy as a eat all you can, I think it's a term they use, an eat all you can democracy. There's no limits. So if my takeaway would be to go back to another great British Prime Minister, not Theresa May or anybody else, or Thatcher, I'm quite happy to have her, but William Gladstone. Gladstone had a very good sense of what the limits of democracy were, what the limits of government were. So I think even after 40 years, Eamonn, our tasks are not over. Ancient as we might be, I think we're still pretty energetic. So just to give him some courage, and please join with me and thank Eamonn tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know you're going back to the cold of the UK, so this might help.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, lovely. Yes,
just a few bookkeeping issues here. First, we at the CIS are funded by good and sound people such as yourselves. So we don't receive any tax dollars. Very rarely do we get money from corporations. We really receive our money and our funding from good people. So any donation, however small, really helps us going to fight the good fight in these polarising times. There's a membership form there. If you haven't become a member, please consider becoming one. Secondly, I want to thank PJ Shanmugam from Phillips Frolic Wines for donating the Aura Rosé. James Halliday's Australian Wine Company says that it is crisp, incisive, its character stands out like a beacon, super spicy, super dry and super long in the finish and aftertaste. And you can always order a case at phillipsfrolic.com.au. And finally, up-and-coming events. Our next event will be held here in this room on Thursday week with Oliver Hartwich, a former senior fellow here at CIS. He's now head of the New Zealand Initiative, which is the equivalent of the Adam Smith Institute and CIS, but in New Zealand. He'll be talking about the threats and dangers posed by the interventionist economics agenda of Jacinda Ardern. And then something different, on March 6th, we're heading out to the the Castle Hill RSL. We're having a big debate on India, free markets and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much, and join me in thanking Eamonn Butler.
Thank you.
So, mate, that was great.